Hello everyone, Tony East here. I cover the Indiana Fever for the Next, and I want to really break down this free agency period that we've seen from the Fever so far. There's a chance they could still do more. I won't speculate there, but it's possible, and I'll explain why I think that's possible later. But what a week it's been since players have been able to negotiate with any team so long as they're not under the core designation. It's been a lot of change in the W, including on the Fever's end. They've made a ton of moves. Really, it's been a month of free agency or so since qualifying offers happened and players could sign training camp deals, but the Fever got involved in late January. Now could have an entire starting five full of very recent former All-Stars. Quite the team that they've built. And I want to run through their free agency period, a lot of the who, what, why, what to expect from the team, why I think some stuff could still be plausible in this video. And I have stories on every move that they've made so far in the Next. If you want some exclusive interviews, behind-the-scenes looks at some of the stuff they did, and things of that sort. The chronological order of the events does matter to some extent here in terms of what they knew was available, how they had to structure their waivers and things like that. But I'm going to go through resume order, if for lack of a better term, on the things that they've done, starting external and then internal. So first up, the biggest move that they've done to me is the Fever added DeWanna Bonner. Very, very sharp move here. Bonner is a great player. Just ask the Fever and the Sun and Stephanie White, the coach of the Fever and the ex-coach of the Sun, who met in the playoffs, the postseason this past year, a Connecticut sweep, although Game 2 was very close, and the experience the Sun had was obvious in that series. I wrote about it in the series preview. I wrote about it and talked about it on this channel after Game 1 and 2, the way the bench minutes were handled for both teams, lots of other aspects of that series. But Bonner was awesome in that series. Nearly 20 points a game, good defense. And what she does very well is gets into a game. And what I mean by that is everybody remembers that moment where her and Caitlin Clark were getting into it a bit, not physically, just, chatting with each other, yapping. I combine those two words when I just said that. And that is good for both players to have that personality. And I think there'll be really additive personalities on the floor, even beyond just the skill part of this. And something Kelly Kroskov, the new president of basketball operations for the Fever, has said before during free agency is veteran leadership experience was important to them. They did not have enough on last year's team, very clearly. Temi Fagbenle had deep playoff experience, Damiris Dantas a little bit, but that was kind of it on last year's team in terms of significant postseason experience, and they got a lot more just from this Bonner edition, and they got even more from another player we'll talk about after this, but I thought that alone made it a pretty solid move, and Bonner's very good. She was an all-star last year for a reason. She can score on the inside and finish. Her shooting's good enough. Her defense is pretty solid, and all that together is what I think makes her a good fit. Beyond that, she's very good and can just fit anywhere. If you're signing up to play for a Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell-led team, you need to be able to, at times, play very much off the ball, right? Because Clark and Mitchell are going to be handling a lot, and sometimes you will be involved in the action, and sometimes you won't. Like the game flow will just go the way it does. Well, for Bonner, I think she could play a great tertiary role, or whatever that's going to be, largely off ball when Clark and Mitchell are both out there, as she had to do in Connecticut at times, like back when they had Jonquel and AT, for example, or any other combination of players, but she can move up a spot in the pecking order very easily if either Clark or Mitchell are on the bench, or if they just need to go to someone with size who can kind of handle on the perimeter. I love that basketball fit part of this. I think Bonner's going to start at the 3 immediately and should. Very talented player, and the 1-year deal, that's going to be true for everybody we talk about today, and basically every free agent signing this off-season in the WNBA. 1 year, $200,000 unprotected for DeWanna Bonner is the contract. She's Fever-bound. That's a huge move. I really liked that one for the Fever. One of the best available options they had that wasn't cored by their previous team, and Connecticut's roster really changed. The Fever were able to take advantage, as many teams did this off-season. The number 2 move the Fever did, very interesting to me as well. Natasha Howard, ex-Fever player, played for Stephanie White with the Fever back in 2015 as that team went to the WNBA Finals before losing to the Lynx. And Howard's resume, different than Bonner. Bonner, 6-time All-Star, 2-time champ, 3-time 6th Woman of the Year, has done a little bit of everything, playing with legends. Diana Taurasi played with Bonner. AT played with Bonner. Grinders played with Bonner. Howard has played for different franchises, won titles in Seattle, and has been awesome all over the place. She has really evolved her game as her pro career has gone on, gotten better as a shooter, still a touch maybe, she's going to be called on to shoot maybe more than she should. I don't know the perfect way to describe that, but she can put the ball in from deep. She can defend for. She's a good rebounder. I think what makes Howard a good fit to me is she's a front court player, certainly, but can play in transition, right? That's going to be big for the Fever this year. I think the open floor is going to be important for the Fever, and that's what made Temi Fagbenle such a good fit, especially compared to NaLyssa Smith, who we'll talk about later. Temi was much better in transition, and I think that is where Natasha Howard's going to shine the most for this Fever team, but can stretch it out a little bit, has good post touch and footwork, and is a former defensive player of the year. That front court combo of Howard Boston, I think, is going to be really sharp on the defensive end. They might struggle against the absolute biggest bigs in terms of size and girth, but they should do a good job defending pretty much anybody in the W this season. Now I think that they have a really good defensive front line and really depth at those spots too. I like the way that they've built this front line between Boston and Mitchell. And Howard and Bonner are pretty additive to me, right? Unless one of them wants the ball more often than I think is plausible for the Fever, they'll be a good fit. I project both of them will start for this team. Howard coming from Dallas, where GM Amber Cox has been in the past. They have a relationship there. Obviously, Howard, originally drafted by Kelly Kroskoff, has played for Stephanie White. What a fit, right? Knows a lot about the Fever franchise and the leadership of it right now. So the fact that all of those people all together were like, yes, we should target Natasha Howard, does make it seem like that fit's going to be great. She gets a 1-year max contract from the Fever, protected at $214,466. Those two, the biggest external gets for the Fever, two of the targets that made the most sense, that were actually attainable without a trade or a core designation getting in the way. I think the Fever did a good job to get both of them and squeeze them into their salary cap situation. Before both of those moves happened, I would say Mitchell is, Kelsey Mitchell's maybe as good or better than Natasha Howard in present day, but this was not an external move, so less buzz from fans. Kelsey Mitchell re-signed. Huge deal for the Fever. She signed her core qualifying offer, which is what I expected her to do. If you want to go back and watch that video I made on this channel about her impending free agency. So she'll make a little over $249,000 this year on a protected deal. I mean, this just felt like a no-brainer resolution to this for the Fever and Mitchell. Everybody in the league is going to want a 1-year deal with the new CBA coming next year, and we'll see how pennies pinch next year for teams. But for this year, if you get an offer that Mitchell just did, a 1-year deal at the highest possible salary you can get, it makes all the sense in the world to take it. There's less speculating about Mitchell's fit with the Fever because she's only ever played for the Fever. I wrote a story in the Next last season about her growing partnership with Caitlin Clark and what made them both play so well off of each other. The Fever studied the Golden State Warriors with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson last year to figure out how they got guard actions going. The Fever got better at those as the season went on, and if they're going to be a team that prioritizes more shooting, wants to play in the open floor, well, Kelsey Mitchell's really fast and a pretty good shooter. So I thought she was going to resign anyway, regardless of the other moves that they made, but adding Bonner and Howard, it all just fits to me in terms of how those players can play. And that is why my speculation that seems to have come true in the post-expansion draft analysis of the Fever of why they would leave Temi Fagbenle unprotected despite her being one of the team's best 6 players last year was because they were going to change styles and be more shooting heavy, and they wanted that spacing. And yes, Temi's very good in the open floor, but if she's going to get a raise and has less trade value as a free agent and is not as good of a shooter as some of the other players, I mean, they have pretty good shooting up and down the roster now, I suppose that would make the most sense. And now with Howard in the door, with the reserve wings that they have, with Dantas on the team, I get it a lot more. But Mitchell making a lot of sense, really hammering home that point about their value. I interviewed her and Stephanie White the day she signed, actually. She came back and we chatted at an Indiana Pacers game. If you want to read some of those quotes, you can see how it goes. But that was what Stephanie White called priority number 1 for the Fever this offseason, was making sure that they could keep Kelsey Mitchell in the house, right? And she'll be great in the X's and O's that the Fever want to have. And White called her a great ambassador for the Fever franchise. They all reconnect, a lot of overlap. Basically, one of the last players Kelly Kroskoff scouted before leaving the Fever for the Pacers back in 2018 was Kelsey Mitchell before that draft pick. And Mitchell called the re-signing the right place and the right time. So I agree with all that. I thought this would be the resolution, and it was. Loaded starting five. I project right now the Fever starting five will be Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, DeWanna Bonner, Natasha Howard, and Aaliyah Boston. 4 of those players were all-stars last year, right? Natasha Howard has been multiple times in her career. I mean, what a team. What a roster that is for a top 5. Really like the way that fits the vision of the way that they've stated that they might want to tweak their play style this year, or the way that just the signings indicate that they want to play differently this year. Good moves from the Fever. Those top 3 that they re-signed or signed in Mitchell, Howard, and Bonner, combining for $663,000 in free agency, but they had a lot to spend between Mitchell expiring contract, between 2 waivers they made that we'll talk about later, between Erica Wheeler coming off the books. A lot opened up for them, and they were able to take advantage. So those are the highlighting things in terms of acquiring actual all-stars. But another theme of their experience and their chase for players who can shoot it is their trade they made involving NaLyssa Smith. Another thing that I'm not doing this to pat myself on the back. I just want to relay why I made these points in the first place came to fruition. The NaLyssa Smith trade they made, a lot of people were very perplexed why they kept NaLyssa Smith in the expansion draft. It was so that they could trade her at whatever they perceived her value to be. This was a very complicated trade, 4-team trade. The headliner was Satu Sabali heading from the Dallas Wings to the Phoenix Mercury, regardless of the specifics everywhere. For the Fever, the trade, they sent out NaLyssa Smith. They sent out their 8th pick in the coming draft, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But they brought in Sophie Cunningham, who we'll get to specific-wise in just a second. The 19th pick, that will come up later. Jaylen Brown, who got hurt a lot last year for the Wings, but if you watched every Fever game last year, you'll remember she tore up the Fever in that preseason game, over 20 points, albeit not playing enough for the Wings last year. And then a swap of 2027 third-round picks with the Dallas Wings. That's rights to swap. I believe that's going from the Fever to the Wings, so the Wings get the better pick. But if someone knows differently, please correct me on that. I haven't gotten perfect clarity in that way. My initial reaction was thinking the value was kind of interesting here. I thought NaLyssa Smith had maybe a little more trade value than getting Cunningham and going back 8 picks, but Jaylen Brown maybe can play if they can find a way to keep her, and I'll talk about why I'm saying it like that later. I keep hinting it later, but there's a lot of minutia I have to get to. Regardless, I think Cunningham's a better player than NaLyssa Smith, so the Fever would have had to move back in the draft in some way to make this happen, and a good fit with the Fever because Sophie Cunningham can shoot and plays really hard, and that is all very important things. She's been to the finals before with Phoenix in 2011 when they lost to Chicago. Again, diving through our archives at the Next of Old Stories was fascinating to see what was said from Nick Uren, the GM of Phoenix, and why Sophie Cunningham made that team go and really click. You can read that in the story as well, but he said, you need the Sophie Cunninghams who grease the wheels. Her shooting ability makes things easier for everybody. She's tough as nails. She plays night in, night out. Her shot profile is really clean. So I think she's the perfect iteration of the type of player you need to get to the top and to win at a high level. That's from a different team's GM and one that had been to the finals with Cunningham before. Mostly a fit thing here, though. Their wing room is now stacked with Bonner, Lexi Hall, Katie Lou Samuelson, and Sophie Cunningham. She can shoot. She can defend threes. She can run around enough to defend twos even if you need her to. I like that fit from a basketball perspective, and on a $100,000 unprotected deal, makes a lot of sense to me. Those were their marquee additions. Jaylen Brown, we'll see. I mean, last year was her rookie year. It took her a few seasons to get established in the league. She's on a minimum, a.k.a. training camp deal. Right now, she's probably on the outside looking in, and I'll explain why, but that could very much change, and it's very early in free agency. It's all very fluid to get to this situation. Regardless, Brown being in this trade does make the value a little closer to making sense, and I think there is a reality where I was wrong, that NaLyssa Smith had less trade value than I perceived. She will have to be paid next year, right? She's on a protected deal, but I mean, I think if she gets to the right team where she can play the 5 more often or doesn't have to play as up-tempo, she'll look a little better, and perhaps Dallas is that spot, and she's reunited with Dejanay Carrington there. So regardless of what I think of the value of the trade, that doesn't matter. The Fever did what is the best trade package they had available to them. What I do like is that Sophie Cunningham fits their team, and Jaylen Brown could fit their team as another young, ascending talent for the team. After that, their last move that they made, this was the most recent. I believe this became official on Thursday. I'm talking on Friday, so yesterday. Sydney Colson coming in the door from the Aces to the Fever. Hey, look at that. Bonner, multi-time champion. Howard, multi-time champion. Cunningham's been to the finals. Sydney Colson, 2-time champ, right? Experience. She played for the Aces. championship team, repeating championship team, knows what it takes to go through that grind. I would imagine is the backup one for this Fever team. I wrote in a story after talking to some people about this move that the Fever do envision a role for Sydney Colson where she has some real usage and could be the backup point guard for this Fever squad. Again, has that experience in the league. At her best was with the San Antonio Stars in the mid-2010s. We'll see what she can bring coming to her first team where she'll probably be asked to play a little more than she did for the Aces, but she is a great personality player. She's been a great vet. There's a reason the Aces have tried to keep her all these years, and again has a clear role on this team that didn't really have a backup one, right? I thought Jaylen Brown can't handle it a little bit. Kelsey Mitchell can certainly handle it a little bit. Bonner can too, but in terms of natural floor generals, I think Sydney Colson is the second behind Caitlin Clark, most natural one on this team. She gets a 1-year, $90,000 unprotected deal from the Fever, so a little over, $17,000 over her minimum salary. You can read all about the background on the Fever's pursuit of Sydney Colson in my story in the next. So altogether, here's my current projection for the Fever's 10-player rotation. The starting five I mentioned earlier: Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, DeWanna Bonner, Natasha Howard, and Aaliyah Boston. If the Fever opt to play 5 bench players, I am going to guess that their 5-man bench unit, that will probably very rarely actually all play together at the same time, would be Sydney Colson as the backup one. Some combination of these 3 players, 2 through 4, assign them to the position you see fit. Lexi Hall, Sophie Cunningham, and Katie Lou Samuelson, and then their backup 5 being Damaris Dantas, who they signed last year. Now, I think immediately people would say, can Dantas really play the 5? I think she can, especially on a team that's going to ask her to shoot, and if she's paired with Howard, then you figure out your combinations from there. But that is where I mentioned about this team maybe being a little smaller, leading to some lineups where DeWanna Bonner is playing the 4, or leads to some questions about, hey, do they need a backup 5? Maybe they do. Maybe that is their most pressing need relating. And so the 2 players I would not have in their top 10 right now that they have the rights for or are under contract would be Jaylen Brown and Christy Wallace. If you feel free to disagree about that second unit, but that's how I currently see it shaking out and where the Fever are. They clearly wanted experience. They got it. They got all-star level talent. They got some sage vets who can help them, and they got players who clearly fit the needs that they have. Now, to make this all happen, they had to do some things, right? Their salary cap situation is very interesting. So the most significant thing in terms of the stuff they had to do to make this happen was waiving Grace Berger, all rookie team 2 years ago, about to enter her 3rd season. She's already been claimed in waivers. She's headed to the Minnesota Lynx, who wanted her contract as is. I think that's smart business, given that it's a rookie deal and that she had a solid first season. So Grace Berger no longer with the Fever. I mean, you could argue that she might be better than Sydney Colson right now, but she is not going to be the Fever's backup point guard this year. And it would have made less sense for her to be buried as a deep reserve for another year with the Fever when she could have helped someone else. So out she goes. I think that one stings. Full disclosure, I went to IU, so I cheered for Grace Berger when she was in college. Not anymore in the pros, obviously. That'd be unprofessional. But I am rooting for her because of that. And I think the Lynx is a good landing spot for her. But from a financial perspective, they kind of had to do this. So it would have been extremely hard for them to keep her without doing something that we'll talk about in a second. They also have Victoria Saxton, who made it through 2 seasons with the Fever after being a 3rd-round pick. I wrote a story about that during her rookie year. I guess she's a backup 5, but she wouldn't have played over their small ball groups. And again, their cap situation meant that is something I expected to happen. Open up the roster spot. We'll see where Victoria Saxton heads, but there was just no role for her on a Fever team that have draft picks coming too. And that is where this goes next, right? They made moves that are smart. I think all their contracts are mostly fair or in line with what most teams did in the current realm of the CBA. But they have 12 players right now, and they're actually technically, I'll say technically, over, air quotes, the salary cap. Jaylen Brown is on a training camp deal. Those do not count against the salary cap until opening night of the season. So technically only the other 11 Fever players count against the salary cap. And with just those 11 players, the Fever are $42,000 shy of the cap. So that's a legal roster. It's in compliance. They could carry those 11 players into the season and feel fine and dandy. But they'd have to waive Jaylen Brown for that to be their roster. Do they want to do that? Maybe they're fine with that, right? They wouldn't have done everything and gotten themselves into the situation and gone, uh-oh, we didn't expect this. Like, they know what they're doing. But I wonder if there's something to come because of that, right? Because they have 3 draft picks. They have the 19th pick that they got in that trade with Phoenix. They have the 20th pick, their own. And they have the 33rd pick, which is their own in the 3rd round. And as of now, they just can't afford them at all, right? I think that is an extremely challenging reality for them to figure out is how do they get those players in the door? And I think they'd have to make a move to do it if they actually want to. The second round picks come with a higher salary than third round picks. And so, in theory, they'd have to shed some money to bring in their draft picks and actually keep them on the roster this year. Here's why I think they might try to do that. Well, one is picking players is good. You want to see rookies in your program. Victoria Saxton made it 2 years as a second-round pick. They've had success with later draft picks a lot in recent seasons in my time covering the team. So here's the deal. If they pick someone now without trading away anybody or finding another way to shed money, and they don't have any unprotected contracts, they could just waive of not good players, right? Their unprotected contracts are DeWanna Bonner, Sophie Cunningham, Sydney Colson, Aaliyah Boston, and Caitlin Clark. They're not going to cut any of those players. Christy Wallace, Lexi Hall, Damiris Dantas, Katie Lou Samuelson, Natasha Howard, and Kelsey Mitchell are on protected deals, meaning if they get waived, they still count against the cap. So the only way for the Fever now to actually free up money to be able to keep Jaylen Brown or to be able to keep their draft picks, or in theory both, would be a trade. Trading away a player for no salary in return or trading away a player for much less salary in return. And that is why I'm keeping an eye on two contracts. That would be Christy Wallace, who is set up to make just over $80,000 this year, and Katie Lou Samuelson at $180,000 for the season. If they could trade, if they need to get to if they could trade Katie Lou Samuelson for somebody making $92,000 or less, they could keep Jaylen Brown and that player that they get, or they could keep a draft pick instead of Jaylen Brown, for example. They'd have the options to do that. $89,000 if they want to keep one of their higher picks in this draft. And if they want to just keep Brown and not worry about a draft pick, they could, cut off $45,000 from what Katie Lou Samuelson makes, take back somebody making in the $135,000 range, then they could keep Brown and whoever that player that they get back is, right? Or if they could trade Katie Lou for no salary in return, or same with Christy Wallace, that would help them be able to keep Brown and potentially the second player. Trading away Christy Wallace for no salary in return would not let them keep a draft pick and Brown, but it would work for Katie Lou Samuelson. So I would think if I'm the Fever, I'm trying to keep my second-round pick this year on the team because of that long-term contract you could get that carries into the next CBA, but is an old CBA contract. That said, if they can't keep their picks because their financial situation doesn't let them, they could always just pick overseas players like the Connecticut Sun did last year, like a lot of teams did last year, and just bring them over when the timing is right. They're not wasting the picks by picking them and then being forced to cut the players. But I would keep an eye on Katie Lou and Christy Wallace when it comes to potential trades to clear some space. And specifically, I'll call a shot here. This is a guess. This is not reporting. But if they're going to move those players to open up the room to keep someone else, keep an eye on the Golden State Valkyries, who did not sign as high end of talent as they wanted, and they have to reach the salary floor this season. Tip Hayes just got a ton of money from them, $200,000 in a deal. Even with the 12 players that the Valkyries have now, which includes, I believe, 6 or 5 players on training camp deals, they would have about $1.1 million in salaries. That's below the salary floor. They need more salary to field a legal team this year. And maybe they're just willing to pay the difference to the league, but if they could, I wonder if they would trade one of their under contract players for Katie Lou Samuelson, or be willing to waive one of their under contract players to then just take in Katie Lou Samuelson's contract with some sort of draft compensation. That is completely a guess, but they are just the team to me that actually needs salary, wouldn't just want it. The Fever have historically taken in salaries to get draft picks before, with like the Bria Hartley trade or Jantel Lavender trade in my time covering the team a few years ago. That is just speculation from me on where this could be headed for the Fever. But if they could trade one of their second-round picks on top of Christy Wallace to get a big, or same thing with Katie Lou, perhaps that's something else they explore. That would really round out their team in a way that makes sense to me. Anyway, that is Fever free agency so far. Natasha Howard's press conference is posted right here on this channel. DeWanna Bonner's is early next week. I'll post that one as well. And later in free agency, when it feels like their team is fully settled, I'll talk about what they could look like on the floor this year, other little stuff they did, their new practice facility, my impressions from these press conferences, and so much more. But this is way longer than I thought it was going to go. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next video. If you need to learn more from me, I'm on Twitter, @TonyREast. And if you comment below, I'll read them. And if it's a legitimate question and it doesn't just feel like you're complaining or whining, I will answer it. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you learned something today. See ya in the next one.